On a dusty provincial road, a herdsman blew into a duda, a bagpipe of the Carpathians. The sound resonated, seemed to reverberate through the land surrounding him. As he played, the song seemed to take on a greater life, as though the tale of this land was contained in the sound. It was a song that evoked feelings of conflict, heritage, and loss. Above the man, a raven passed in the sky. The song seemed to follow the bird as it flew. Beneath the bird, on the plains below, were riders on horseback, traversing that dusty provincial country. The man continued to play, alone on that empty provincial road, playing a song to no one, a song to God alone, of Hungary. In 1456, the largest, most technologically advanced army in the world advanced on the city of Belgrade. Belgrade was a fortress, a poorly maintained one, but a fortress nonetheless. At that time a part of the Kingdom of Hungary, the city controlled access to the Pannonian Basin. To the back of the city was the Danube River, while to its west ran the Sava, a tributary of the Danube. In the city was Janos Hunyadi, the regent and high warlord of Hungary, a veteran of over 20 years of war with the invaders, the Ottoman Turks. In middle age he walked with a cane. With Janos were Blaise Magyar, one of his greatest supporters and a huge titan of a man, and Janos's brother-in-law, Michael Zalati, more a diplomat than a warrior, but in charge of Belgrade's central fortress. Hearing of the Ottoman assault, an Italian priest, John of Capistrano, came from Naples to organize a crusade. He rallied a peasant army across Hungary, who joined the nobles in the defense of Belgrade. The Ottoman Turks, the rising power of the East, had only 3 years before conquered Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. They broke open its walls with a new and formidable technology, gunpowder. Now that same weapon was pointed at Belgrade. Originally the capital of Serbia, Belgrade became a part of Hungary after Serbia's conquest by the Turks. The city was essential for the defense of the kingdom. After Constantinople, it was the next most defensible location in Eastern Europe to stop the advance of the Turks. Beyond Belgrade, Hungary was a massive plain. If the fortress fell, there was little to defend the country from conquest. The Turks brought a flotilla of ships, which sailed up the Danube and combined with the army, encircled the city. For 10 days, the city was cut off from reinforcement. Janos ordered the construction of a fleet, which went out in a sortie and defeated the Turks, ending the blockade. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, came with the army, leading his elite soldiers called the Janissaries. Estimates placed the Turkish army at 45,000, and the Hungarian men-at-arms at 17,000. The Turks pointed their siege guns at the walls, Mehmed directing the engineers to begin their bombardment. In the city, its defenders took refuge, as the new technology rained destruction upon them. Eventually, a breach was made in the walls, and Mehmed ordered a general assault. Hunyadi had his soldiers take up positions behind the breach, the narrow opening weakening the invaders' advantage in numbers. Capistrano's peasants were an inexperienced, ill-equipped, and unruly mob, but made a major contribution in defending the city. Forced through the narrow breach, the Turkish attack descended into a brutal melee. Turks climbed the walls and attacked the defenders. Yet during the battle, a Christian archer saw the Sultan and struck him with an arrow. Creating discord, the Turks ended their assault. With the arrival of a relief force, the next day Hunyadi led an attack outside the city, routing the invaders. Outside Belgrade, the Crusaders looted the abandoned siege guns of the Turks, a vision of their victory. Across Europe, news of Hunyadi's victory spread and turned him into a celebrity, especially in Hungary. This video was originally focused on Matthias Corvinus, but over time it's expanded to tell the full story of the rise and fall of Hungary. I've kept the original title because the life of Matthias is the glue that holds the narrative together. You can use timestamps to navigate the video, and if you want to continue with the tale of Janos, you can jump ahead to the section on the Hunyadis. Otherwise, we'll explore the historical context, examining the histories of the Turks and Hungarians, before returning to the lives of Janos and his son Matthias. The Turks were originally a nomadic people from Central Asia. In the early Middle Ages, Motivated by climate change, they migrated west, in the process creating an empire in the Middle East. Converting to Islam, they became one of the most effective proselytes of the religion since the time of the Arabs. During the rise of Islam in the 8th century, Muhammad left a prescription for his followers. He encouraged them to conquer Constantinople, completing the work he started in Arabia. The Turks will invade Anatolia in 1000 and defeat the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantine, or Eastern Roman Empire, the last Christian power in the East, will suffer a fatal blow at the Battle of Manzikert. During the battle, the Byzantines made a crucial error in dividing their army. The faster Turks noticed this and exploited it, encircling one of the armies before the other could relieve it. Crushed, the Byzantine emperor himself was captured. He was made to sign a humiliating peace, and then was turned into a human footstool of the Sultan. The Turks then proceeded to migrate into Anatolia. Having been a nomadic people, the Turks found a place to settle. The Anatolian Plateau is the Near East's most influential area, able to support a large population and project power over the Levant and Mesopotamia. For each person Greece could support, Anatolia could support 10 people. This made the Byzantine loss of Anatolia a fatal defeat. After settling in Anatolia, however, political power among the Turks devolved. They divided into a series of regional beys or lords. One of these beys, Osman, will go on to unite the Turks. His name will become the basis of his dynasty, the Ottomans. His success will come from 2 factors. First, his embrace of gunpowder, the latest military technology, and second, his pragmatism. These 2 tenets will be embraced by his successors. While others remained in traditional modes of warfare, Osman saw the potential that lay in gunpowder. He realized it would make archery, armor, and castle walls obsolete. Meanwhile, his pragmatism led to the so-called Ottoman tolerance. By not persecuting their conquered populations, the Turks could expand rapidly through the spiritually and ethnically diverse Middle East. The Ottoman Empire will be a dynamic and adaptive power. After unifying Anatolia, the Ottomans will cross the Hellespont, advance into Europe, and encircle the Byzantine capital, Constantinople. Founded by Constantine in 300 AD, Constantinople was the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. A coveted city, it was the major metropolis of the East, occupying a defensive position and controlling trade in and out of the Black Sea. In this capacity, it grew rich from trade, similar to Troy in the Bronze Age. In 1453, the Turkish Sultan, Mehmed II, later known as Mehmed the Conqueror, began the siege of the city. Though surrounded, the siege was a stalemate, Constantinople defended by its double walls built by Emperor Theodosius. Arriving at the siege was a gunsmith from Hungary named Orban, who first offered his services to the Byzantines. Unable to pay him, he offered his services to the Turks, who hired him to build the largest siege gun in the world, the Great Bombard. With his formidable gun, the Turks began their bombardment. After breaching the walls, the Sultan ordered an assault, and the last Eastern Roman Emperor, Constantine, fell in defense of Byzantium. Renamed Istanbul, Constantinople would become the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. Its churches, like the Hagia Sophia, were turned into mosques. Growing into a major urban center, Istanbul would project its power into Egypt, the Levant, and Eastern Europe. After the fall of Constantinople, the Turks turned their attention to Hungary. Geographically, Hungary takes the form of a vast river basin, originally named Pannonia by the Romans. It's fertilized by 2 great rivers, the Danube and Tisa. Its geography makes it suited to agriculture, as well as an excellent place to graze horses. Meanwhile, the basin is defended by a ring of mountains called the Carpathians. Hungary was located at the end of the vast highway of steppe that passed through Eurasia. This made it a natural site where nomads would disembark at the end of their migrations. The most famous of these steppe peoples were the Huns, who are the origin of Hungary's name in English. Originating in Mongolia, in the late classical era, they were forced west by the Chinese emperor. As they migrated across the steppe, they broke into 2 branches, one moving south into India and the other west toward Europe and the Roman Empire. The European Huns would settle in Pannonia, and under the leadership of Attila, create a powerful empire. Fierce warriors, the Huns would subordinate their neighbors, the other barbarian peoples like the Goths, before leading them in an invasion of the Roman Empire. Their initial attacks targeted Byzantium, extorting them for gold. After discovering the weakness of the Western Roman Empire, however, they would launch invasions of Gaul and Italy. By this time, the Western Roman Empire had experienced a demographic collapse and lost their famous military tradition. Instead, they hired barbarian peoples as mercenaries, called auxiliaries, to fight for them. Unable to defend themselves, these peoples would often turn on the Romans or settle in their lands, undermining the Western Roman Empire further. Attila would lead a famous campaign into Gaul, ravaging its cities before the Romans and their allies confronted him at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, including barbarians who fought on both the Roman and Hunnic sides. It would be the largest battle in Europe until the First World War. After reaching a bloody stalemate, the Huns were forced to withdraw. Attila would return, however, in a campaign to invade Italy. The Huns destroyed several Italian cities before disorganization and disease spread among the Huns. Attila would famously meet the Pope outside of Rome, having an audience with him before deciding to withdraw from Italy. Attila would return to his court near Buda, which later traditions said was named after Attila's brother, Bleda. After marrying a new wife, Attila fell unconscious in his wedding bed and developed a nosebleed while unconscious. His young wife refused to wake him and let him suffocate on his blood. His sudden, grim death seemed an appropriate end for someone who had caused so much destruction. Though the Huns did not capture Rome itself, which would be sacked by the Goths, the Hunnic Empire played a central role in the destruction of the Western Roman Empire. Without Attila, the Hunnic Empire rapidly disintegrated, and the Huns disappeared from the historical record. Byzantine sources recount them serving as mercenaries, but they would never reclaim their former power. The Hungarians were the last of the nomadic peoples to settle in Hungary. They arrived in the 9th century, and like the Vikings, were one of the last European cultures to remain pagan. Ethnically, they arrived in a region that was a melting pot of ethnicities. Celts, Romans, and Huns had all inhabited Hungary. The Hungarians, or Magyars, who themselves had been a confederation of 10 tribes, would assimilate the ancient and medieval peoples who settled in the Pannonian Basin. Hungary was founded by the Arpad dynasty, who were originally the tribal leaders of the Magyars. Departing Old Hungary, their ancient homeland east of the Urals, they migrated west across the steppe before reaching Pannonia. Under King Stephen, the Hungarians converted to Christianity, inviting Catholic missionaries who baptized the monarch and his subjects. On converting, Stephen received 2 crowns, one from the Pope and one the Byzantine emperor. The Byzantines sent the so-called Corona Graeca, or Greek crown, open at the top and surrounded by flat plains decorated with icons. Meanwhile, the Pope sent the Corona Latina, or Latin crown, a conventional Western crown with a closed top. The Hungarians combined the 2 parts, creating the unique appearance of their modern crown. The synthesis of the 2 symbolized Hungary's unique location between East and West. Later, the Arpads would go extinct in the male line, resulting in foreign kings coming to rule Hungary. The most famous of these would be the French House of Anjou, which culminated in the reign of Louis the Great, and the German House of Luxembourg, which rose to its greatest heights under King Sigismund, who later would be elected Holy Roman Emperor. Sigismund was the first of the Hungarian kings to face the Turks. After the Turks crossed the Hellespont into Europe, their rise alarmed the Western Christians. Crusades were launched against them in an effort to drive them back to Anatolia. Hungary, on the border between the Christian and Islamic civilizations, will be embroiled in constant war. The Westerners will launch 2 crusades to repel the Turks and relieve Byzantium. The first of these will occur under the reign of King Sigismund in 1396. This crusade targeted the fortress of Nicopolis in Bulgaria. Joining the Hungarians, and following the tradition of Romantic crusades, were knights from France and Burgundy. Yet a challenge of this multinational force was unity of command. The French knights, led by Philip of Artois, refused to take orders from the Hungarian king out of pride. Meanwhile, another knight, John de Vienne, counseled against this, emphasizing the need to cooperate on the battlefield. When battle came, the French made an early charge, which, though successful, separated them from the rest of the Crusader army. They were then encircled by the Turks. The Hungarians entered battle to relieve them, but were unable to reach the French knights, who were captured or slaughtered. What remained of the army was either captured or fled, with most of the Christian prisoners executed later. Sigismund was one of the survivors who fled back to Hungary. A second crusade against the Turks, targeting Varna in Bulgaria, occurred in 1444, just before the siege of Constantinople. The young King Vladislav, who had been elected King of Poland and Hungary, led a campaign to drive back the Turks. With him was Janos Hunyadi, who, after fighting the Turks for over 20 years, had developed a tactic to defeat them. With the Turks superior in technology and numbers, Janos adopted a defensive mode of warfare. Inspired by the Hussites of Bohemia, he used the Wagenburg, a style of warfare that used great wagons built for war. Reinforced with iron, the wagons were brought along with the army, then arranged in defensive rings to repel enemy cavalry. Meanwhile, archers and arquebusiers would fire on enemies out of protected ports. Vladislav, who was young and impetuous, was counseled by Janos to be patient on the battlefield. At this time, Mehmed II, the future Mehmed the Conqueror, was the Sultan. However, as a minor, he had no experience with leading soldiers to war. His father, who had abdicated to let his son be Sultan, was called from retirement to lead the army. The Turks and Crusaders met at the Battle of Varna. Janos assumed defensive positions and waited for the Turks to attack. The Turks sent their army against him in 3 waves, attacking first with the light infantry, then the Ottoman regulars from Anatolia, and finally the elite soldiers called the Janissaries. Each time, Janos repelled them, though after the defeat of the 3rd wave, Vladislav became overconfident. He ordered a cavalry charge that he personally led from the front, and though initially successful, the Ottomans withdrew, separating him from the rest of the army. Similar to Nicopolis, once separated, his knights were encircled and slaughtered, the king himself among the slain. What remained of the Hungarian army withdrew, with Janos returning to Hungary. At both Nicopolis and Varna, the Christians performed well when they fought together and defensively, yet impetuous charges in both crusades led to defeat. The Hunyadis were from Hunyad County in Transylvania. A new dynasty, Janos' father Vik, was born without a name, meaning he was a commoner and noble during his lifetime. He was promoted from a court knight of King Sigismund to a nobleman. He was granted Hunyad County in Transylvania, from where he derived the name Hunyadi. The root of the word Hunyad comes from a Hungarian verb, which can be translated as to close, to die, or the flame goes out. It's used to refer to going to sleep or closing the eyes. Its meaning is a coincidence, given the family's association with the legend of the sleeping king. Janos will marry Elizabeth Zalati, allying himself with their dynasty. Her brother Michael will be a key ally of Janos, and later serve as Palatine or chief minister of Hungary. In 1444, the young King Vladislav died in a fatal charge at Varna. His crusade was broken, and Hungary and Poland entered into regnums, periods without a king. Janos Hunyadi returned to Buda and became the regent, effectively exercising all the powers of king without the title. During this time, the Turks built the Great Bombard and conquered Constantinople in 1453. Finally, they turned their attention to Belgrade, which they attacked 3 years later. At the Battle of Belgrade, Janos distinguished himself, becoming a national hero and celebrity. Yet soon after his victory, Janos fell ill and died, likely a result of the siege. He passed away at 50 in 1456. His death would destabilize Hungary and begin a Game of Thrones. Though the Hungarians lost the so-called Bear of Belgrade, quickly after his victory, great things were expected of his sons, who inherited the aura of their father. Ladislaus, the elder son, had the nature of a warrior, while Matthias, the younger son, was a scholar. After the death of his father, the 25-year-old Ladislaus became the new leader of the Hunyadi faction in Hungary. This included his uncle, Michael Zalati, and Blaise Magyar. Janos had been a protective father and tried to shelter his sons from politics. However, his premature death will plunge them into it. The Hungarian nobles elected a new monarch, the young 16-year-old ruler of Austria, Ladislaus Posthumus. A Habsburg, his title Posthumus, which means to be born after, came from his being born after the death of his father, Albert II. Not only Hungary, but neighboring Bohemia, elected Ladislaus Posthumus king as well. His lack of a father would prove a defining part of his life. Inheriting so many titles at a young age, he became a puppet of handlers and regents. His first captor was his much older cousin, the 41-year-old Emperor Frederick III. At this time, Austria was divided between different branches of the Habsburg family. A grandfather had divided the country between his sons, rather than pass it to one heir. This resulted in different Habsburgs ruling over Tyrol, Styria, and Austria proper. Frederick was a Holy Roman Emperor, though at the time this was mostly a ceremonial title. Meanwhile, he ruled over his hereditary lands in Styria or Upper Austria. His young cousin, Ladislaus Posthumus, ruled Austria and had been elected king of Bohemia and Hungary. Due to this, Frederick III will hold his cousin captive, giving him control over Bohemia and Hungary. During this time, under the auspices of holding it for his cousin, Frederick will seize the crown of Hungary and bring it to Styria. One folk history tells that while it was being transported, the top was damaged, creating the crown's iconic bent cross. Eventually, Ladislaus Posthumus will leave Styria and travel to Buda, rising to power in his own right. Still youthful, however, he'll come under the influence of his uncle, the German noble Ulrich von Silly. Hungary will divide into two factions, a Habsburg faction, which supported foreign rule, and a nationalist faction which supported the Hunyadis. Modeling himself after the medieval knights, Matthias's brother Ladislaus took charge of the Hunyadi faction in Hungary. At this time, he was 25, while Matthias was 14. Ladislaus became bolder and more defiant, as the Hungarian nobles became more hostile to the Habsburgs. The two factions met to parley in Belgrade, but there a melee broke out between them instead. Hunyadi sources claim that Ulrich had contrived a plan to assassinate Ladislaus and Matthias. Revealed, Ladislaus Hunyadi and his retainers confronted Ulrich and killed him. Ladislaus Posthumus then invited the brothers to Buda to reconcile, but there he captured and beheaded Ladislaus and imprisoned his brother Matthias. Having gained precarious rule over Hungary, Ladislaus Posthumus traveled to Prague, taking Matthias with him. There he met the regent of Bohemia, a Czech nobleman named George of Podebrad. Similar to Janos before him, Podebrad was a regent, but had all the factual powers of a king. Ladislaus Posthumus came to Prague to assert his claim, and while there put Matthias into Podebrad's custody. While here, however, Ladislaus Posthumus will die suddenly at age 17. Here speculation enters the story. With so many people who would have benefited from his death, it's likely the young king was assassinated. From him, Frederick III inherited Austria, while the regent George of Podebrad declared himself king in his own right in Bohemia. Meanwhile, in Hungary, the Hungarian estates, encouraged by Matthias's uncle Michael Zalati, made the 14-year-old king. Released from custody by Podebrad, Matthias traveled to Hungary. In a scene on the frozen Danube, the nobles proclaimed him as monarch, as though from a medieval folktale, a prisoner had become the king. In his youth, Matthias would be tutored by John Vitez, a bishop, humanist, and poet, while his uncle Michael would serve as regent. The king's court would be at Buda on the Danube. At this time, Budapest did not exist. Instead, there were two cities, the capital Buda, a small castle city on the west side of the river, which had evolved out of the royal residence built there by King Sigismund, and Pest, the true commercial center, located on the east side of the river. Only in the Victorian age will the two cities combine into Budapest. As Matthias entered adulthood, he began to rule in his own right, and it became clear to his subjects the character of the king they elected. In the 15th century, a movement began in Italy called the Renaissance. One of its causes was the fall of Constantinople in 1453. This caused many Byzantine scholars to flee west to Italy, bringing their texts with them. The Renaissance led to humanism, which believed that man had inherent dignity, and a revolution in art, aided by the development of oil painting. The first place the Renaissance traveled to outside of Italy was Hungary. This was due to the uniqueness of its monarch, Matthias Hunyadi, who embraced it enthusiastically. Matthias would marry Beatrice, a daughter of the King of Naples. She would bring Italian advisors with her to Hungary, in the process importing the Renaissance. At the time, Hungary didn't exist in the Italian imagination. Only with the rise of the Turks and their invasion of Europe did the kingdom begin to enter their consciousness. Italians came to see Hungary as a kind of barbarian kingdom, fighting against the expansion of Islam. Matthias was a builder who constructed fortresses, focused on the border with the Turks. In Buda, he was a patron of astronomers, sculptors, and poets. He'll employ Regiomontanus, an astronomer who was a forerunner of heliocentric theory, and John Ernest, a Hungarian Jew, who will become his royal treasurer. With him, Matthias will reform Hungary's system of tax collection, having the monarch collect all taxes, as opposed to local rulers. This prevented the nobility from extorting additional incomes from the people. Matthias will let peasants address their grievances in royal courts, taking them away from the legal power of their landlords. Matthias will restore the country's gold mines, adding to the income he'll gain from tax collection. Matthias's most famous legacy was his creation of a library for Hungary. At the time, books were rare and extremely expensive, and were made by hand in scriptoria. Creating a book was a painstaking process, requiring a scribe to manually copy another text. Books were made out of vellum, the skin of sheep, which made them enduring and resilient. To beautify their texts, scribes would create illuminations or small drawings, and begin sentences with large capital letters called Lombardic capitals. Matthias joined a competition with the Papal Library and Lorenzo the Magnificent, ultimately compiling the third largest library in Europe at the time of his death. During this time, Matthias would gain the title Corvinus, deriving from the Latin word for a corvid or crow. His raven sigil would then be placed on his books, along with a gilded binding. His books, which came to be called Corvinae, were written in Latin, the language of learning. His scribes will transcribe the works of Aristotle, Plato, Xenophon, and Thucydides. In the Middle Ages, society was organized according to the feudal system. The world was larger, and kings delegated to maintain power. A king had vassals under him, like dukes and counts. When he went to war, he would call these nobles to arms, and they would provide him with soldiers. Nobles would maintain a retinue of knights at their expense, and raise the rest of their soldiers from the peasantry. Yet this system made the monarch weak and dependent on his vassals. Matthias, who read Caesar's commentaries, learned several lessons from it. He learned the value of having a standing army, loyal personally to him, like Caesar's legions. He learned the importance of discipline, experience, and unity of command for the army. And he learned the importance of propaganda, just as Caesar wrote the commentaries as a work of self-promotion. Recalling Philip of Macedon, Matthias built a standing army. He inverted the usual feudal system, demanding higher taxes from his vassals rather than retinues. He then used his higher income to hire a full-time mercenary army called the Black Army. As mercenaries, they were already professional soldiers, likely to outperform the peasant levies of his rivals. Unlike the condottieri of Italy, who were famous for their disloyalty, Matthias's army was loyal personally to him. The Black Army will be an international force. It included heavy cavalry, who were usually Hungarian nobles, pikemen from Germany, and crossbowmen and arquebusiers from Bohemia. It included Italian engineers, who were its specialists in siege warfare. The Black Army let Matthias become independent of the nobles, giving him substantial power. Like Philip of Macedon, the increasing experience of his army let Matthias's power snowball over time. Maintaining peace with Poland and the Ottomans, he turned to his western neighbors, Bohemia and Austria, to expand at their expense. Recalling the prince, Matthias knew that a ruler's focus should be on warfare and the preparation for it. In a time that was violent, dynamic, and unpredictable, Matthias's army was the best insurance in a rapidly changing world. One of the duties of a monarch is to sire heirs and prepare their legacy. The most famous tale of this in history was that of Henry VIII, who married 6 times and became a tyrant in pursuit of a male heir. Matthias was under similar pressures. Marrying the young Beatrice seemed at first to guarantee future heirs. The two married in 1476, when Matthias was 33 and Beatrice 19. However, the couple would repeatedly fail to conceive, and after many disheartening miscarriages, they stopped trying, resigning themselves to an infertile marriage. Not wanting to insult his wife, the marriage was never annulled, yet its sterility had a clear effect on the king and queen. In their early portrayals, they're shown as youthful and vital, though in their later ones they look unhappy and overweight. Psychologically, both turn to food to ease their pain. Matthias would birth an illegitimate son, named Janos after his father. Without noble birth, there was little chance he could become king. However, Matthias did try to legitimize him as a nobleman and grant him land in southern Hungary. One of the major rivals of Matthias will be the Emperor Frederick. The ruler of Styria and Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick will enter the game of Central European politics much older than its other players, being 27 years older than Matthias. As we said, Frederick benefited from the death of Ladislaus Posthumus, gaining him control over Austria. He also controlled the crown of Hungary, a vestige from when he imprisoned his cousin in Styria. The Habsburgs were an ancient dynasty, dating back to their castle in Switzerland in the 11th century. Meanwhile, Matthias, coming from a new dynasty, needed sources of legitimacy like the crown. Without it, Matthias ultimately developed a different image. He was portrayed wearing the bay laurel of Caesar or Augustus. In doing so, he connected his reign with the Renaissance and the Greek and Roman kings of antiquity. Ultimately, Frederick returned the crown, but only in exchange for high ransom, though this blatant extortion will permanently damage his relations with Matthias. During the 1400s, confronted with the corruption of the Catholic Church, ministers began to criticize the papacy. One of these figures was John Hus, who came to prominence in Bohemia. Hus rejected the power of the Pope, wanted to translate the Bible from Latin into the vernacular, and rejected indulgences, remittances for sin, that were literally sold by the Church. After converting many followers in Bohemia, Hus was lured to a church council with promises of reconciliation, then betrayed and burned at the stake. Despite this, his teachings remained popular in Bohemia. As we mentioned, after the death of Ladislaus Posthumus, George of Podobrad became king of Bohemia. A moderate Hussite, Podobrad tried to reconcile the Catholics and Hussites, but due to his heresy, the Pope excommunicated him. Seeing the strength of Matthias's army, the Pope encouraged him to invade Bohemia, ironically attacking his former captor from childhood. The Black Army performed well on the battlefield, and Matthias seized Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia, the peripheral territories of Bohemia. Despite this, he was never able to conquer Bohemia proper, which was protected by its surrounding mountains and density of castles. Ultimately, Matthias seized the Catholic majority regions, while Podobrad controlled those of the Hussites. Matthias became the Catholic king of Bohemia, while Podobrad was the Hussite anti-king. During Matthias's time, Hungary was bordered by the two Danubian principalities, Wallachia and Moldova. Called Vlachs, these Romance speakers were descended from the original inhabitants of Dacia. During this time, Wallachia was a pawn in a game between the Ottomans and Hungary. When Janos was alive, he would install friendly princes to rule Wallachia, while the Ottoman Porte would impose its own. King Sigismund, in the age of Nicopolis, had created a military order for those who distinguished themselves fighting the Turks. Called the Order of the Dragon, the organization was difficult to join. One of its members would be Vlad II of Wallachia, who fought with Sigismund at Nicopolis. On joining the Order of the Dragon, in Wallachia he'll gain the title Dracula, or Dragon, for himself. Appropriately, his son Vlad III, later known as Vlad the Impaler, received the title Dracula, or Son of the Dragon. On the death of Vlad II, his two sons feuded over his succession. Vlad III will be supported by the Hungarians, while his brother, Radu the Handsome, will be supported by the Turks. Radu lived at the court of Mehmed the Conqueror, and a rumor suggested that he and the Sultan were in a long-term love affair. Vlad will gain his infamous reputation and his epithet of the Impaler for his practice of impalement. When impaled, a victim's legs and arms would be broken, and they would be placed on a high pike inserted up the anus. Over time, gravity would drive the pike up the victim's insides until it ruptured through the top, killing them and tearing them in half. What remained would be a terrifying totem of a real human being killed by a tyrant. Vlad used impalement not only against his enemies, but against his people as well. Despite this, he'll be one of the most dynamic and capable opponents of the Turks. For this reason, he'll be remembered as a patriot in Romania, despite being an evil sadist. In Europe, Vlad became so infamous that engravings about him were made. One of these showed him eating bread at a table made for him in the countryside, him dipping his bread in the blood of his victims as he ate. Mehmed would lead an invasion to seize Wallachia, but Vlad would ambush the Turks in the so-called night attack. This battle was a major victory for the Wallachians, and nearly resulted in the Sultan's assassination. As the Turks proceeded with their invasion, they encountered a spectacle created by the Wallachian prince. Vlad had staked 25,000 people in the countryside, creating a forest of the impaled. The sight was so horrifying it frightened even the Turks, who thought they were fighting with someone who had a demonic nature. Many began to desert, and with no progress made against Vlad's guerrilla warfare, Mehmed returned to Istanbul. Later, Vlad will be deposed, and on fleeing to Hungary, came into Matthias's custody. There, Matthias kept him imprisoned in one of his castles, and not lacking a sense of humor, took visitors to see him as a spectacle. Ultimately, Dracula was a real person and a capable foe of the Turks. His uniquely evil nature came to inspire Eastern European folklore about vampires. The Great Bombard of the Turks left an impact on Matthias. To him, it represented the transition to modernity, the shift from Constantinople's medieval walls to the new age of gunpowder. Importing engineers from Italy, they designed new weapons of war for the king. Among these would be Matthias's own bombard, the elephant gun. Not turned on the Turks, however, Matthias used it against his other rival, the Emperor Frederick. After building one of Europe's most effective militaries and resolved the conflict in Bohemia, Matthias declared war on Frederick of Austria. Despite Frederick being the Holy Roman Emperor, this was a mostly symbolic title, and Frederick's soldiers only came from Styria and Austria. Successful in his invasion, Matthias advanced to the gates of Vienna. In a kind of inversion of Belgrade, he directed his engineers to unload the gun until he made a breach in the city's walls. He then sent his soldiers through the breach, capturing the city. In an act of contrapasso, Matthias showed that a state that was a victim of such a weapon could make its own. After conquering Vienna, Matthias moved his court to the city, turning it into his new capital. Meanwhile, Frederick fled to the Alps, the emperor humiliated. Despite this victory, Matthias fell ill and died in Vienna suddenly in 1490, 5 years after he captured the city. Dying prematurely at 47, and without a son and heir, the system he built began unraveling. As we said, Frederick entered the game of Central European politics as its oldest player, but won by simply outliving his rivals. Matthias's early death led to the collapse of his empire, and Austria returning to Frederick. The Greek philosopher Plato believed the best form of government was that led by a philosopher, devoted to justice, beauty, and wisdom. He was the best person to organize society. Like those bound as prisoners in Plato's cave, Matthias had been a prisoner before becoming king. It's likely his early adversities made him more humane and less willing to impose injustice on others. This theme recurs in history. In ancient Rome, its worst rulers were those born in the purple, like Nero and Caligula, while those who rose to power from adversity, like Caesar and Trajan, were the most capable. Matthias will join the two other philosopher kings of history, Marcus Aurelius and Frederick the Great, showing the reality of Plato's form of government. Matthias's failure will be in not adequately preparing his legacy. Like Caesar, his work will be unmade by his premature death. We've said before that geography is destiny, and we see that in the history of Eastern Europe. Poland and Hungary were vast, rural, and agricultural. Cut off from trade, they didn't develop merchant classes like the kingdoms of Western Europe. Their populations lived as serfs, ruled over by landlords. The nobles of these countries became powerful. In Hungary, their rights were codified in the Golden Bull, while in Poland, the nobles gained the liberum veto, or free veto. This let any Polish nobleman block a law from passing in parliament. The native dynasties of these kingdoms went extinct. Without stable hereditary succession, like developed in France, they became elective monarchies, making the central government even weaker. In Western Europe, states centralized in the early modern period. Countries like France began with the same powerful aristocracies as Poland and Hungary, but their powers gradually eroded as absolutism developed. Thomas Hobbes explained this process in his book Leviathan. He saw a kingdom as divided into the one, few, and many, the king, nobles, and peasants. The nobles were the biggest threat to both the monarch and the peasants. Thus the king and the peasants created a kind of political alliance. In a healthy development, the monarch's power expanded, eroding the nobles' authority and empowering the populace. This paved the way for the nation-state and the development of free subjects. In the East, this process failed, leaving the states there backward and vulnerable. Class conflict was a theme of Hungarian history. The peasant army that John of Capistrano was able to raise at Belgrade was only possible in the time of Janos. While the country was united for the Battle of Belgrade, class tensions worsened over time. Matthias mediated this during his reign. However, with his death came a devolution of power to the nobility. With the Ottomans still a threat, in 1514, the Pope sanctioned a crusade to be organized in Hungary. George Doza, a military veteran, was given command of the Crusader army, which was gathering in Transylvania. Yet as this army gathered, it became clear they had greater grievances against their countrymen than the Turks. The crusade shifted into a popular revolution. The peasants and lower classes rose up against the nobles' tyranny. Rather than invade the Ottoman Empire, the army began attacking Hungarian castles and churches, capturing nobles and executing them. Doza made a rallying cry across Hungary for its peasants to rise up in rebellion, declaring himself the new king of Hungary. The nobles, with their superior resources, assembled a large army to crush the rebels. After defeating his army, they would capture Doza and decide his punishment. Doza would be forced to sit on an iron chair, made red hot by fire. An iron crown, made searing hot by flame, would be placed on his head to mock his claim to be king. After he was burned alive, the nobles forced Doza's allies to eat his flesh. The reign of Elizabeth Bathory is the best example of a class war the nobles waged against the people. A member of the powerful House of Bathory, Elizabeth's relatives would rule both Transylvania and Poland. The noblewoman herself owned several castles in Upper Hungary, today modern-day Slovakia. With no oversight on her power, she became the most prolific female serial killer in history. Bathory abducted girls from her domain and tortured them in her dungeons. An evil sadist, she would inflict the most pain on the girls as possible before killing them. Like Vlad the Impaler, myths would develop around her. These included tales of her bathing in her victims' blood, believing the blood of virgin girls would retain her youth and vitality. Bathory would carry out these crimes for 12 years, and in her trial was accused of 80 murders. Only after repeated complaints was Bathory finally investigated. Her cousin, Palatine at the time, arrived to interrogate her while she was in the midst of a crime. Bathory would bite, beat, and starve her victims, burn them with hot iron or boiling water, starve, strangle, and cut them, and subject them to sexual humiliation. Put on trial, she was found guilty of torture and murder. Due to her rights as a noble, however, she wasn't put to death, but sealed in one of her castles under house arrest, like in the cask of Amontillado. Her story illustrates the inequality and abuse that divided Hungary and made it vulnerable to conquest. As we said, after Matthias's death, his system was dismantled by the nobility. Tired of high taxes, the Hungarian nobles would elect a weak king, Vladislav of Bohemia, as their new ruler. In Hungary, he was nicknamed King Bene, or King OK, for his meek acceptance of whatever law the nobles brought before him. They exploited this to unmake Matthias's system of tax collection. Then, after going unpaid, the Black Army disbanded, returning Hungary to the feudal system. To save funds, the kingdom's defenses also went neglected, just as Belgrade had been in the age of Janos. Vladislav's accession did unite Central Europe. He ruled both the Catholic and Hussite parts of Bohemia, in addition to Hungary. In theory, the resources of the two kingdoms would suffice to resist the Turks. During the reign of Vladislav's son, Louis II, the Turks returned. This time, they were significantly more powerful and were led by their greatest monarch, Suleiman the Magnificent. King Louis called his nobles to arms, However, the Bohemians refused to join the Hungarians in battle, showing the weakness of the feudal system. The outnumbered Hungarians were defeated at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. The young king was killed, and the Turks seized much of Hungary. Due to the vastness of the country, it was partitioned, the south to the Turks, the west to the Habsburgs, and the east to the new Principality of Transylvania. In Buda, the Turks encountered the library of Matthias. Its books were taken as plunder, while their gilded bindings were also torn off. This resulted in the destruction of the library. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Turks reached their imperial peak. In addition to Eastern Europe, the Levant and Egypt came under their rule, while the North Africans accepted Ottoman hegemony as the Caliph, or leader of Islam. After falling to the Turks, Hungary faced a demographic collapse. Those unharmed by the invasion fled to Austria or the new Principality of Transylvania. Reduced to a rump state after the death of Louis II, its remaining nobles elected the Austrian Emperor, King of Hungary. The Habsburgs will inherit the vestiges of the Hungarian kingdom, as well as its war with the Turks. The gold mines of Upper Hungary and modern-day Slovakia were sold off to the Fuggers, a wealthy German banking family. After a failed attempt to retake Buda, the Austrians withdrew until the Turks besieged and failed to capture Austria in 1529. Habsburg Spain joined with Austria and began a greater pan-European war with the Turks. For 150 years after Mohacs, Hungary was occupied by the Turks. Finally, in 1683, a coalition of powers, including the Austrians, Poles, and Venetians, invaded the Ottoman Empire to liberate it. Led by one of history's great generals, Eugene of Savoy, the coalition defeated the Turks at the so-called Second Battle of Mohacs. The Pannonian Basin was freed of the Ottomans, though it was now under Habsburg rule. The history of Hungary is one of conflict, heritage, and loss, and this theme is embodied by the Hunyadis. Janos fought the Turks for over 20 years, and though outnumbered and out-equipped, held at Belgrade. Ladislaus led his family's faction to take power in Hungary, and proved himself as a knight before being executed. Matthias, when king, took the right actions to develop his country properly. He began the process of centralization described by Hobbes, created a standing army, and patronized learning in the arts. Yet the theme of the Hunyadis, like the meaning of their name, is the image of the eyes closing or the flame going out. Despite the fury of their lives, they all died prematurely before they could finish their work. This outcome evokes a sense of injustice for those familiar with the story. This likely led to their association with the tale of the sleeping king. In European folklore, there is the idea of the sleeping king. In German history, it's portrayed as Frederick Barbarossa, while in Hungarian history, it's Matthias Corvinus. Entombed under a mountain, the king sleeps through the ages. Around the mountain where he sleeps are ravens, who circle the mountain and look after the king. In mythology, when the ravens stop circling, the king awakens. His spirit rises, and he rides forward with his retainers to lead his people. This is the mystic vision the king will ride out.